Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the incredible true story of Rob Roy MacGregor. We're going to separate the romantic legend from the complex and honestly sometimes brutal historical facts of the man who became the ultimate symbol of Scottish resistance.
Historian David Stevenson actually hit the nail on the head when he said there are two Rob Roys. One lived and breathed, the other is a good story. And to really understand this history, we have to constantly reconcile that famous chivalrous folk hero you probably think you know with the morally ambiguous, opportunistic cattleman who actually roamed the Scottish Highlands.
Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The man versus the myth. 2. Cattle, clans, and conflict. 3. Becoming a Highland outlaw. 4. The Jacobite rebellions. And finally 5. Capture, release, and legacy. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The man versus the myth. Origins of Rob Roy.
So he was born Robert MacGregor back in 1671 near Loch Treen. But you're probably wondering, where does the name Rob Roy actually come from? Well, Roy comes from the Gaelic word ruath, which simply means red. It was a direct reference to his incredibly ruddy complexion and his bright red hair and beard. It was actually a super common Highland tradition to name people based on physical traits. But this simple little nickname, it would eventually become famous all over the world.
Moving on to Section 2, Cattle, Clans, and Conflict, Highland Society.
Now, Rob wasn't just some commoner. He was born into a highly respected family. His father, Donald Glass MacGregor, was what's called a taxman for Clan MacGregor. Think of a taxman as a middle-tier landholder. They managed estates for the clan chief, and in return, they provided military support and unwavering loyalty to the clan hierarchy. This meant Rob's family held immediate social and political power right out of the gate, collecting income and managing the land.
But here's where things get interesting. The clan's main economic engine was something called the Watch. And let's be real, it was essentially a rural protection racket, and young Rob Roy was an absolute natural at it. Here's how it worked. Wealthy lowland gentry would pasture these massive herds of cattle in the Highlands. Rob's men would then collect protection money to guard these cattle around the clock from bandits. If any cows were stolen, the Watch had to either go retrieve them or pay for them out of pocket. So as you can imagine, it was a highly lucrative but incredibly dangerous line of work.
All right, Section 3, Becoming a Highland Outlaw, Financial Ruination.
Okay, so the ultimate turning point in his life revolves around a massive loan of £1,000. Rob thought his income from the Watch was rock solid, so he borrowed this huge sum to invest in his very own cattle herd. But then, absolute disaster strikes. His chief herder, the guy he explicitly trusted with all that cash, literally vanished into thin air. Rob couldn't repay the debt, which led to total, devastating financial ruination.
And defaulting on that loan had massive consequences, mostly because of who he borrowed it from, the Duke of Montrose. Montrose didn't mess around. He immediately evicted Rob, banished him from the land, and officially branded him an outlaw. This kicked off a fierce, decades-long blood feud. But Highland politics were complicated. Montrose had a huge rival, the Duke of Argyll. Argyll saw a golden opportunity here. He scooped up the newly outlawed Rob Roy, offering him a place to live and some opportunistic protection. The catch? Rob had to act as Argyll's local enforcer to actively disrupt Montrose's interests.
Just to give you an idea of how he operated, look at this brazen, literally movie-like heist he pulled on Montrose's tax collector, Graham of Killearn. To get his revenge, Rob masterminded this whole scheme. First, he spreads rumors that he's fled to Ireland. Then, he secretly hides his black watchmen in the woods. Rob casually strolls into the local inn, completely unarmed, and has a drink with Graham. Out of nowhere, he signals his piper to play a specific tune, and his men storm the place. They kidnap Graham, steal the tax money, and actually maroon the poor guy on a remote island in a loch for days. It was this exact kind of theatrical audacity that cemented Rob Roy's reputation as a fiercely intelligent enforcer. He definitely had a hard edge.
These escalating raids finally pushed the government in Edinburgh right over the edge. They officially declared his Watch a marauding clan and slapped a staggering bounty of 1,000 Scottish pounds on his head. So, with the military and bounty hunters constantly closing in, Rob and his men had no choice but to vanish into the rugged Highland woods.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Jacobite rebellions, fight for the throne.
Now, to understand his political life, we have to look at this incredibly dense timeline. In 1685, the Catholic James II takes the throne, but he's quickly deposed in 1688 by Protestants William and Mary during the Glorious Revolution. Fast forward to 1714, and the German Protestant Hanoverian king George I takes power. This switch deeply upset a lot of people in Scotland and ignited the Jacobite uprisings. The Jacobites, named after the Latin word for James, wanted to restore the Catholic Stuart line to the throne, and Clan MacGregor, including our guy Rob Roy, fervently backed this cause.
But here is the catch. While he's famous today as this die-hard Jacobite rebel, the historical record paints a picture of a guy with very ambiguous loyalties. Take the massive 1715 Battle of Sheriffsmuir. Rob famously showed up late and completely missed the close-quarters fighting. Was it an accident? A lot of historians argue he intentionally dragged his feet to protect his cozy relationship with the Duke of Argyll, who, by the way, was commanding the opposing royal forces that day. Now, compare that to 4 years later at the 1719 Battle of Glen Shiel. There, Rob undeniably fought right alongside 300 invading Spanish troops in a battle where the Jacobites were decisively crushed by the British Army.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, Capture, Release, and Legacy, the final years.
Eventually, his luck did run out. In 1722, Rob was captured by his old nemesis, the Duke of Montrose, largely because he was betrayed by members of his own clan. He ended up spending 5 long years in prison, but thanks to his sheer fame and some very influential political friends, he dodged execution and was pardoned and released in 1727. He lived out his final days quietly until he died in 1734. But as you can see on the timeline, the true legacy of Rob Roy kicks into overdrive decades later in 1817 when Sir Walter Scott publishes a book about him.
Before we talk about that book, though, let's look at those actual final years. He totally ceased open rebellion. Frankly, he was in his late 50s by then and probably just didn't have the energy for it anymore. He officially converted to Roman Catholicism, and there's this great historical anecdote. When he was confessing his sins, the priest demanded he forgive his enemies. Rob, clinging to those deep Highland grudges, was incredibly reluctant to agree. His fierce pride never left him. Legend says that on his deathbed, he demanded his sword, dirk, and pistol be brought to him, declaring that no enemy would ever be able to say he died defenseless. All of this happening while his piper played a mournful tune called I Return No More.
Honestly, Rob Roy probably would have remained just a localized historical footnote if it weren't for Sir Walter Scott's highly fictionalized 1817 novel. It was an absolute blockbuster for the 19th century. Just look at that number. It sold a monumental 10,000 copies in its very first run. Scott didn't bother with boring state papers or hard facts. He used colorful folktales. And by doing that, he single-handedly invented the chivalrous, romanticized legend of the freedom-fighting Highlander that we all still consume in pop culture today. It was perfectly timed with the rise of romantic nationalism across Europe.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Based on the historical evidence we've just unpacked together, the protection rackets, the bitter feuds, the kidnappings, and those very ambiguous battlefield loyalties, was Rob Roy truly the embodiment of Highland independence and honor? Or was he just a brilliant, opportunistic outlaw who survived by playing both sides? It is a fascinating question, and I'll leave it up to you to weigh the evidence. Thanks so much for joining me today to explore the reality behind the legend.